President Faust, fellow deans, colleagues on the faculty and staff, students and guests, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Horace de Lentz Memorial Lecture and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor E.J. Dionne. The Lentz Lecture occurs every 3 years, and today we're honored to have Professor Dionne speak to us as the William H. Bloomberg Visiting Professor at Harvard. This is an appointment in the spirit of President Faust's vision of One Harvard, bringing together the Divinity School, the Kennedy School, and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It would be hard to exaggerate the impact E.J. Dionne has already made on our campus, with his deep knowledge of American political culture, his immense generosity of spirit, his winning sense of humor, and his love of teaching. So we're very grateful that he's here, and also grateful to Mayor Bloomberg, whose generous gift to the university enabled us to bring E.J. Dionne to Harvard at this particularly important time. In the spirit of donors and visionaries, please allow me to take a few minutes to talk about the donor of the Lentz Lecture Series and the terms of the gift. Mr. Horace de Lentz was a Harvard College graduate, class of 1891, who went on to become a lawyer and member of the bar in Carbon County, Pennsylvania. The terms of the memorial lectureship are as follows. In 1963, Mr. Lentz bequeathed that the income of his gift should be used, quote, for the giving of one or more lectures every third year upon the inspiring things he may discern in the words Christo et Ecclesiae, which appear upon the Harvard seal. Now, to those of you who are listening carefully, which of course is everyone, I hasten to note that the Harvard seal has changed and varied over the years, and now displays Veritas without the surrounding words that Mr. Lentz saw on the Harvard seal at that time. So, E.J., we want you not only to cover everything implied in the previous seal, but the current seal as well. So, no pressure. So, Professor Dionne is a distinguished journalist, widely published author, much sought after political commentator, and Washington Post op-ed columnist. In addition to his journalism work, Dionne is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a government professor at Georgetown University, and a commentator on politics for National Public Radio, ABC's This Week, and MSNBC. He holds an A.B. summa cum laude in social studies from Harvard College in 1973, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa and was affiliated with Adams House. He also earned a D.Phil in sociology from Balliol College in Oxford in 1982, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. His extensive published works include the influential 1991 bestseller, Why Americans Hate Politics, which argued that several decades of political polarization was alienating a silent centrist majority. Just think if we hated politics 25 years ago. Yes. Looking at the books he has published since, he begins to have the appearance of a prophet. These include Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and the Politics of Revenge, published in 2004. Sold Out, and this is with a no U, not a no. This is the Divinity School. Sold Out. You get it? You're a hard audience. Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith in Politics After the Religious Right, which is published in 2008. Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent in 2012, and Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond in 2016. More recently, together with Norman Ornstein and Tom Mann, E.J. has just published One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not-yet deported. This book not only offers an expert diagnosis of how we arrived at this moment in our political culture, but even more impressively lays out a fourfold way forward for our deeply fractured country. The first is building a new economy that reckons with the growing inequality and despair in many communities across our country. Secondly, a new patriotism based on a respectful pluralism as against populist and nativist-inflected nationalism. Third, a new civil society based on a revivified sense of community all over the country. And fourthly, a new inclusive democracy to challenge what he calls a pervasive sense of political cynicism. What is remarkable, I think, about E.J.'s work is his ability to proclaim a progressive message without falling victim to elite condescension, and to treat religious values seriously without capitulating to sanctimonious pieties and platitudes. These are unusual qualities, but wonderful ones for a Lentz lecturer. E.J.'s deep knowledge of public affairs, his long record of distinguished reporting and commentary, and his keen insight into the intersections of religion and public life make his a vital voice in our national conversation. So it is with very great pleasure that I invite E.J. Dionne to deliver this year's Horace de Lentz lecture with the title, quote, Fighting for Justice with an Open Heart, Conviction, Empathy, and the Niebuhrian Imperative. E.J., thank you.
I love that man. That was so generous. In fact, for years I have responded to generous introductions like that by noting one I once received that ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. But everyone in this room and beyond has been so generous to me, has made me feel so at home here. The actual residency of this particular dope is now in doubt, and I want to thank you all for making me feel so welcome. It is great to be back in my native Massachusetts. I'm a son of Fall River, a little ways south of here, and I like being in a place where everyone knows what actually happened in Deflategate. And I always say that I loved Deflategate because it taught me the joys of being a Fox News commentator. I did not care what the facts were. I just knew which side I was on. It's a great honor to be offering this lecture, and a particular honor to be offering it to an audience that includes Drew Faust, the president of this great university, and also David, the dean of the Divinity School. I'm grateful that I have had a chance to give this talk during President Faust's final year because she has been an inspiring leader for so many of us and has contributed so much to this university. And she actually contributed the inspiration, a part of the inspiration for this talk, as I will get to in a moment. She's sitting next to my dear friend Jim Kloppenberg, and it is good to have him at the Divinity School because, as you may know, Jim has argued that St. Paul is actually the key to the democratic spirit. He said democracies don't work unless we can see through one another's eyes and think through one another's minds. And that, too, is very much part of the talk I want to give here. And in pondering what I wanted to say about David, even before that excessively generous introduction, I remembered what I said about a particularly warm and thoughtful evangelical conservative friend. I said of him, he's a remarkable person. He's a Christian who behaves like a Christian. And as soon as I said that, I realized this is a rather devastating critique of the tradition that I have been part of all my life. But whether that critique is fair or not, David is not only a brilliant scholar, but someone who really does behave the way Christians like to see themselves behaving, above all in his profound generosity and warmth, and in his work on behalf of peace and understanding, and in his openness to an intellectual engagement with absolutely everyone. And it's just grateful to be part of this community. It's worth remembering what this great scholar of Methodism said about John Wesley's opposition to slavery. David wrote, Christian movements have always been at their best when their agendas are about expanding human freedom, protecting the vulnerable, and fighting against injustice. We can all say a loud amen to that for our time and for every time, and it also has much bearing on what I have to say tonight. I want to thank my new colleagues at the Divinity School, many of whom I see here tonight, and also at the Committee on Degrees in Social Studies and at the Kennedy School and the Ornstein Center, not only for making me feel at home, but also for opening my mind and broadening my understanding every day, and in many cases, for performing what might be called intellectual works of mercy by helping me teach my classes. And to everyone in this room who's come into my classroom, I want to say thanks. I'm grateful that Harvard has been so open to my lifelong fascination with the relationship between religion and politics, which goes back to having been raised in my dear hometown of Fall River, where the links among party, church, and union were part of everyday life. And I'm happy to welcome my sister, Lucy Ann Dionne Thomas, here tonight. She understands exactly what I am talking about. As I try to note to my students here, it's always important for scholars of religion to be aware that the practical work of winning votes and elections, in this work, fine theological distinctions are often lost. Reinhold Niebuhr tells the story of Al Smith confronting anti-Catholic prejudice in the 1928 presidential campaign. And he had to answer for every papal encyclical ever issued. And Niebuhr says that at a meeting, a frustrated Smith turned to his aides and said, "Will somebody just tell me one thing? What the hell is an encyclical?" And the moral is that what we think is going on in the dialogue between religion and politics is not always what is actually going on. And John F. Kennedy thought in 1960 that he had proven that a Catholic could be elected once he won the West Virginia primary. There was a fairly obvious religious test there. Hubert Humphrey, his main opponent, subtly used the song "Give Me That Old-Time Religion" as his campaign song against Kennedy. And so Kennedy had put this aside, and then one day the Vatican issues a statement suggesting that the church indeed had a right to instruct the faithful how to vote. And it opened up the controversy all over again. And Kennedy burst out, "Now I know why Henry VIII started his own church." And I will stay out of the Henry VIII controversy this evening. And finally, there's Barack Obama, whose opponents claimed he was a Muslim when he was in fact a Christian. And then they later admitted he was a Christian, but he found out during the controversy over comments made by his pastor, Jeremiah Wright, that they were saying, well, if Obama is indeed a Christian, he was a Christian that, in their view, a Christian of a very defective sort. And so Obama couldn't win either way. And I've always thought that in his struggles with both race and religion, his hero must have been Job. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. When I was asked to give the Lentz lecture, Karen Grunder-Whitaker provided me with a wealth of information, including pictures of a lot of old Harvard SEALs. And thank you, Karen. Where are you, Karen? Thank you for so many, there you are. Thank you for so many kindnesses and for much good advice. Her research only sent me Googling for more information on this lecture. As the dean explained, Christo et Ecclesia is the theme. I came across a Harvard Crimson article published in April 26, 1921, saying that it was first used by the Dutch, and the original words, as David suggested, were Veritas Christo et Ecclesiae, meaning truth for Christ and the church. Now, more conservative Christian critics of Harvard have noted over the years that we lifted up Veritas and dropped Christo and Ecclesia, Christ and the church. This might be the cause for some debate. Professor Noah Feldman of the law school was in my class the other day, and he said that the Divinity School owes its very existence to Harvard's decision to put some distance between theological concerns and the broader college, and later the university. Actually, Noah, if you know him, is irrepressible. And he said this decision by Harvard was meant to send two messages. One, that theology really mattered to Harvard, and two, that theology really didn't matter to Harvard. Given the diversity of religious and philosophical views represented on this campus in our country and in the world, the move to pure and simple Veritas can be defended as an embrace of pluralism. And these days, insisting that truth exists is a rather radical act. But it's also quite consistent with the Christian scripture that taught us that the truth will make you free. The implication is that truth is enough all by itself, and that the goal of Christians, the pursuit of truth, wherever it leads us and however uncomfortable it might make us feel, is an objective that can be shared across the lines of faith and by those who are skeptical of religion altogether. I'd like to hope that Mr. Lentz might agree with that. He was active in politics, I learned in my research, so I'd also like to hope that he'd think that right about now we need a lot more Veritas in our politics and a lot less of the alternative. I've always admired the call put forward by the philosopher Glenn Tinder to build what he called an attentive society, a place, as he wrote, that honors strong conviction, but where everyone acknowledges the need both to give and to receive help on the road to truth. Again, we very much need to rediscover that spirit in our country, and I'm blessed to be here at the Divinity School because it is a place where people give and receive help, and where people work, in David Hollinger's wonderful phrase, in intellectual solidarity. Intellectual solidarity, I think, should be the goal of all great universities, a point that President Faust has made over and over again. Like many here, I will deeply miss her. As I said, I'm greatly grateful for all she's done for Harvard. But I have a particular debt tonight for the morning prayer she offered at Memorial Church at the beginning of this term, because it helped me clarify what I wanted to discuss. She gave as good a definition of the purpose of this in any institution of higher learning when she said, "We believe in the pursuit of truth as our common purpose. We believe in the power of learning and discovery to enhance human capacity and in our responsibility to develop that capacity to serve the world. We believe in the value of every member of this community and in each person's potential to contribute to the common good." Drew, you should come teach at the Divinity School in your next job. Universities must be open places where our goal, as she put it, is to enrich, to educate, and to challenge one another. But pursuing the truth does not mean being neutral or detached in the face of hatred. Hatred, after all, is inimical to intellectual solidarity that the pursuit of truth requires. President Faust thus called out what happened this summer in Charlottesville, condemning, as she put it, the loathsome demonstrations of hatred and violence, reviving the most shameful episodes of the past, and foregrounding the very worst of what we have been and regrettably still are as a nation. Now, her comments go to the heart of what I want to talk about. My sense is, in a sense, an invitation to all of you to help in a work that I think is essential at this moment in our country's history. It is to try to work out what I see as a deep tension between two objectives we must pursue simultaneously at this very difficult time. On the one hand, how can we fight for justice, inclusion, equality, openness, liberal democracy, and the importance of truth itself without any equivocation and without fear? All of these ideas and values are under attack now, and we must not shrink from the responsibility to battle that the battle to defend them imposes on us. Pardon me. How can we insist that there can be no compromise with discrimination, bigotry, or hatred, and no letting up in the battle to push back against autocracy, authoritarianism, and lawlessness? How can we seek to follow Martin Luther King Jr., who drew on the prophet Amos to declare that our objective should be to hasten the time when justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream? But if this is one obligation of our current crisis imposes on us, there is another that requires a very different way of thinking and demands the mustering of different political and intellectual resources. A case can be made, and I think it's a compelling case, that our nation is as deeply divided as it has been at any time since the 1850s, a period President Faust has explored throughout her career. Now, I am reluctant to make this comparison because the 1850s culminated in a civil war. But it's been said that we are in the middle right now of a cold civil war, and however you might feel about that observation, it is certainly too close to the truth for our comfort. Doug Elmendorf, and I'm very glad to see you today, and also your wonderful daughter. It's so nice of you to come this evening. Doug, the Dean of the Divinity School, who I thank this evening, Divinity School, I'm trying to sacralize you, the Dean of the Kennedy School, thank you. The sacred dean of the Kennedy School. And I know also as our kids attended the same high school and remember him from many back to school nights. He confronted the discord I'm talking about at last year's Campaign Managers Conference. Over the years, that conference has made an enormous contribution to our understanding of politics. I finally have to admit that I am getting a little older because as an undergrad, I was involved in organizing the first such conference after the 1972 election. But however divisive the confrontation between George McGovern and Richard Nixon was, it did not require a Kennedy School dean to do what Doug had to do in a thoughtful statement in which he made clear that inviting certain speakers did not mean endorsing or legitimizing their views. Nor, he said, did it mean that we are unsure of our values. Doug was moved to quote Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's declaration that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas. Now, Doug's plea for reasoned dialogue should be saluted, and it was certainly needed this year. The conference that followed those remarks was the most contentious in the 44-year history of these encounters. So this illustrates the second obligation I want to talk about. How can we bring together a nation that is being torn apart? How can we repair the social and political fabric of a land in which people across lines of region, party, class, and race seem incapable of understanding each other and often appear to loathe each other? How can we promote empathy across our lines of division so that it becomes possible to identify simultaneously with African Americans and immigrants struggling against a rising tide of racism and nativism, while also identifying with white working class Americans struggling with devastated living standards and shattered communities? And in the process, how can we acknowledge that a working class that is now getting a great deal of rhetorical attention, but not much real help, is in large part African American, Latino, and Asian, and not just white? It is a truth that the great scholar here at Harvard, William Julius Wilson, pointed us to many years ago in his path-breaking work on the costs of deindustrialization. Thus, the tension I am referring to in the title of the talk: how can we fight for justice while maintaining open hearts? I ask you to join in the work of grappling with this tension, both because it is, as I see it, one of the most important questions before us, and also because I can only hope here to begin what needs to be a serious and ongoing effort at discernment leading to considered but urgent action. I told David when I was talking about the subject of this speech that I propose to ask an unanswerable question, and then we'll try to answer it. And that's what I'm doing here tonight. I'm going to turn to a variety of sources, but we'll come back often to Martin Luther King Jr., because very few leaders engage this dilemma more effectively or productively. And I am very intimidated that I am staring at one of the greatest scholars of Dr. King's work right in front of me. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Let me start with one way to pose the question, which is, how can we call out evil, injustice, and danger without assuming that all of those with whom we disagree are themselves inherently evil or dangerous? This, I think, requires faith in the power of conversion of ourselves as well as others. The late Jerry Watts, an important scholar of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, reminded us of why that great undertaking was and remains morally inspiring. Quotes, "We can easily forget or underestimate the significance of the moral persuasiveness of the normative vision generated within the movement," Watts wrote. "Whites were led to believe that they should act on behalf of black civil rights, and blacks were led to believe that there were sufficient numbers of white Americans of goodwill who wanted to see the racial reality altered. And because the movement was situated within a Christian moral discourse, the movement rhetorically reinforced the possibility of the moral and political conversion of its adversaries. We thus need to renew our faith in the power of conversion, which is rooted in more than just our conviction that we are upholding values and principles that are worthy of embrace, that we are really preaching good news. Conversion also entails attentive listening to those with whom we disagree and empathetic understandings of the situations in which our interlocutors find themselves. It also means finding common sources of inspiration, something Martin Luther King understood when he appealed to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and also to the Scriptures, and particularly the Exodus story. King insisted, after all, that his dream was deeply rooted in the American dream. At the Great March on Washington, he went out of his way to express solidarity with our white brothers who, by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound with our freedom. But he did this without backing off from the fierce urgency of now, and he warned against dependency on the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. For King, conversion and militancy were not in conflict. They were part of the same project. Another approach is to ask how we can be righteous without being self-righteous. Reinhold Niebuhr put the challenge this way: the final enigma of history, he wrote, is therefore not how the righteous will gain victory over the unrighteous, but how the evil in every good and the unrighteous in the righteous can be overcome. Yes, even those of us who think we are righteous need to acknowledge the limits of our own vision and the ways in which we can sometimes deceive ourselves. We need to ask if, in serving what we see as our values, we might, in fact, merely be serving our interests. And even if we are persuaded that we are, in fact, serving the good, we still need to remember that even the best of us always operate from complicated motives. Thus, one of my favorite Niebuhrisms, we must always seek the truth in our opponent's error and the error in our own truth. Note carefully what Niebuhr is saying here. He is not saying we need to abandon our convictions or our commitments. We can see ourselves as speaking the truth, and we can insist that our opponent is in error. But we can do so in a way that searches for the elements of truth in our foe's arguments. Again, doing this can be seen as part of the conversion process, while also acknowledging that our own commitments often carry elements of self-interest that we don't wish to acknowledge, and an arrogance that is both a barrier to communication and a direct contradiction to our claimed egalitarianism. This is the Niebuhrian imperative, to understand the obligation to act in the world forcefully and without hesitation, while always being mindful of our own imperfections and our will to power. Niebuhr's famous description of the purpose of politics reflects these twin duties. To establish justice in a sinful world is the whole sad duty of the political order. Lastly, my friend Kathy Cavany of Boston College, whom we are blessed to have with us tonight, offered a brilliant formulation of the problem we face in the title of her recent book, Prophecy Without Contempt. Think about that wonderful idea, prophecy without contempt. We badly need prophecy right now. We don't need and must resolutely avoid contempt toward our brothers and sisters, our fellow citizens, even when we think they are very wrong. Religion's most powerful public role, she argues, involves prophetic indictment of our shortcomings. And she holds up Dr. King and Abraham Lincoln as models of this work. Kathy makes her point powerfully by noting how changing one letter in a word can make an enormous moral difference. The word condemn, with a D, means to pronounce an adverse judgment on, to express strong disapproval of. That is the job of the prophet. Lincoln condemned slavery, and he was right to do so. Dr. King condemned segregation, discrimination, and economic injustice, and he was right to do so. But there was another side to Lincoln and King, and Caveny underscores this by contrasting the word condemn with a D to the root word of contempt, which is contemn with a T. This involves holding or treating others, quotes, as of little account or as vile and worthless, as unimportant or of small value. As Caveny argues, to treat one's political interlocutors as vile or worthless is to risk undermining their equal status as participants in our political community. It is to treat them as unworthy of citizenship, as people who must be pruned from our common endeavor. Caveny also sees King and Lincoln as models because as they called out evil, they maintained a lively sense of humility. Imagine preaching humility at Harvard University. They understood the limits of their own knowledge and acknowledged their own moral shortcomings. They displayed, as she put it, social humility regarding the status of other peoples, including one's enemies, in God's affections. In other words, they didn't consign their foes to hell. Each of these closely related approaches suggests how we might begin the task of condemning evil without deepening our divisions. To remember with Jerry Watts the power of conversion, which requires imaginative engagement with the concerns of others. To remember with Reinhold Niebuhr the importance of seeing our own imperfections and short-sightedness. And to remember with Kathy Caveny that we cannot build a stronger democracy if we treat our opponents as unworthy of a common citizenship. But what of our obligations to fight injustice? I worried as I was writing this talk that I would begin to sound like that telling parody of the liberal who is someone so open-minded that he can't even take his own side in an argument. It's easy to preach the merits of civility from the comfort of affluence. And to put an even finer point on the matter, one can imagine critics fairly pointing out that it is easy for someone who is white and male and straight and native-born to miss the urgency of this moment, to play up the need for understanding over the imperative of opposition and resistance to daily injustices. They would argue for the role of dissidents and rebels and prophets. Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of King's great allies who marched with him in Selma, said the prophets saw God not as comfort and security, but as a challenge, an incessant demand. Heschel wrote, while others are callous, and even callous to their callousness, and unaware of their insensitivity, the prophets remain examples of supreme impatience with evil, distracted by neither might nor applause, by neither success nor beauty. Their intense sensitivity to right and wrong is due to their intense sensitivity to God's concern for right and wrong. They feel fiercely because they hear deeply. We cannot allow a desire to understand and persuade to become an excuse for not feeling fiercely or hearing deeply. Similarly, Dr. King was profoundly impatient with those who criticized his militancy and saw his movement's demonstrations in Birmingham as they put it in a letter to him, unwise and untimely. King wrote back very harshly in his letter from Birmingham jail. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. Lamentably, it is a historical fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture, but as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us, King went on, groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. It is easy, King added, for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. Oppressed people, he declared, cannot remain oppressed forever. Thus did a man resolutely committed to dialogue and nonviolence and conversion nonetheless insist that there were times when militancy is essential, when cooling off periods only chill the struggle for justice, when it is a mistake to heed calls for civility over the cries for relief from oppression. So where does this leave us in our quest to fight injustice in ways that might leave us more rather than less united when the struggle is over and, God willing, ends in success? Let's stipulate, following the king of Birmingham jail and invoking President Faust's words again, that there should be no backing off from strenuous and unbending opposition to the loathsome demonstrations of hatred and violence. There is so much we need to argue about in politics, openly, civilly, and respectfully. But racism and sexism and nativism and homophobia are unacceptable always and everywhere. But so too are prejudices related to class. We must oppose the bigotry of skin color, but we also must oppose the bigotry that denies the wisdom and virtue of those who lack college degrees or large bank accounts. We once celebrated the honor and dignity of manual work, of those in the healthcare sector who do not carry the title doctor, and of those in the service industry who are not high-tech wizards. We must do so again, yes, through policies that reward hard work that is currently underpaid, but also through a clear national affirmation of the equal dignity of every one of God's children. Some of the ballots cast last year for a candidate who spoke in reprehensible terms about our citizens of color, particularly immigrants, were motivated by their own sense of exclusion, from a belief that their fellow citizens in our great universities, our cultural institutions, and our prosperous metropolitan areas lacked respect for who they are, what they do, and what they believe. It is essential to the battle for social justice that we join together to fight a politics that casts one group's pain against another group's pain. We must heal the overt injuries of race and gender prejudice, but we must also heal the often hidden injuries of class. At the same time, in our quest for mutual understanding, we should not give in to the temptation of a false balance that pretends that both sides are equally guilty of polarizing our national conversation. There is a moral difference between those who exploit prejudice and those who do not. There is a moral difference between the anger of those who suffer and the smug indifference of those who benefit from an existing status quo. Indifference can seem like civility because smugness doesn't need to raise its voice. It is satisfied with things exactly as they are. A false equivalence seeks to locate the person embracing it in some metaphysically perfect paradise of moderation as he calls out the extremes to either side of him. But the two sides are not always equally extreme, and I would certainly assert that this is true today. Dr. King, for one, took great offense at seeing his nonviolent movement for justice labeled extreme by moderate clergy who sought to distance themselves from his struggle. The rhetorical power of King's rebuke to them in his Birmingham letter should remind us of the need to ponder carefully what we are saying when we use the word extreme. Was Jesus Christ was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? And Abraham Lincoln, the nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be, King wrote. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? These are fair questions in his time and any time. If moderation in politics can sometimes be an evasion, then, it can also be an admirable personal virtue, and we need discernment to understand when it applies and when it is falling into the sins that Martin Luther King described. If moderation is simply splitting differences with no regards to no regard for outcomes and no regard for justice, or as in King's example, to the actual content of the two opposing positions, it is no moral guide at all. But moderation is powerfully useful if it involves, in Niebuhrian fashion, checks on our own self-interested passions, or on our arrogance, or on our tendency to demonize not only actual demons, and yes, they are out there, but absolutely anyone who takes a different view from our own. I want to close by asking, why even bother to engage in the circle squaring that I have undertaken tonight between the need for militancy and even resistance and the imperative of healing our divisions? When I described what I intended to do in this talk, a friend said that I was proposing that people needed to be loving fighters. She was kind in saying that she liked the idea, but it also sounded like a contradiction in terms, or perhaps the name of a failed rock band. But I see no other way. We need to take on not only prejudice and division, but also tendencies toward autocracy and authoritarianism, visible in efforts to sow confusion about the truth, demonize the free press, attack an independent judiciary, delegitimize and threaten to jail political opponents, and undermine lawful inquiries into a leader's possible abuses. Vigilance against these things is not alarmism. This is a time that requires friends of freedom to speak up. Yet as we fight the daily battles, we must remember that our purpose is to assert the existence of a common good, and the common good cannot even be defined, let alone achieved, in a society racked by deep division, mistrust, and mutual recrimination. In a way, our side needs unity even more than the other side does. The great reforming movements in our nation's history were brought about through a combination of struggle and community building. Dr. King described his goal not as the domination of one group over another. He was fighting domination. He spoke of creating a beloved community where all would sit together at the table of brotherhood. This still must be our purpose. When my friends Norm Ornstein, Tom Mann, and I were writing our recently published book that David kindly mentioned, we had long conversations about what we should call it. And when we settled on one nation after Trump, we realized that we owed a debt to the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, it's lost in the mists of history that the pledge was written in 1892 by a progressive, actually a Christian socialist minister named Francis Bellamy. But when you think about the last 7 words of the pledge, and recall that God was not added until 1954, but when you think about the last 7 words of the pledge, this is less surprising. We commit ourselves, when we recite it, to one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Notice that the idea that we are indivisible is intimately related to our commitment to liberty and justice for all. Healing our country requires that we rededicate ourselves to the hope that we can overcome our divisions, because this is finally the only path to achieving liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bless you all. Thank you so much. And I think there's a Q&A here where I place searing questions, a critique of my King scholarship, please. Or a critique of my Niebuhr scholarship. We also have America's expert on Niebuhr sitting in this audience who will help teach my class. Thank you very much. So if you could wait until the mic arrives and then just identify your name, and all questions have a question mark at the end of them. So thank you. Sometimes I worry that a lot of my answers have question marks at the end of them. the president of the Reinhold Niebuhr Society. True.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. One of the questions that I have been thinking a lot about recently actually comes out of a newspaper article that appeared, I think, in the New York Times that talked about Trump's presidency as the death of humility. And I was really taken with your emphasis in this talk on moderation. But I'd be very curious to know how you understand the place of humility in our current political culture, in other aspects of our lives. Like, how do you think about the kind of revolution that might need to happen in this cultural moment to turn our political conversation in new directions?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I mean, there really is not a lot of return to you, to those who engage in humility right now. And there is, you can argue that we have a profoundly anti-humble culture, that people are encouraged to brag, never to admit error, always to say that the product they are selling is the best, because anything short of that will be seen as an admission of a fault. And with President Trump, obviously we are off the charts, and someone for whom clearly that word is unknown. I'm not fully sure he knows its definition. And it's very disconcerting. I would, however, note, I can't resist noting that there were certain elections around the country on Tuesday that suggested something I think very important about a pushback against not only his policies, but also a whole way of engaging a presidency. What's interesting is that so many successful public figures in the past did channel humility. I mean, John F. Kennedy was someone who was deeply sure of himself. This was not a man who lacked self-confidence. But I don't think anybody was more masterly at kind of self-deprecating humor and at least conveying a sense to you, fellow citizen, that he understood that he was not a perfect person. Lincoln was extraordinary in being someone who expressed humility. The whole second inaugural address, here's a guy who just won this enormous conflict. The South is about to surrender. And instead of speaking grandly about, we're winning every day, for example, he is someone who said that God's judgment falls on equally against both sides, even though he was also uncompromising about slavery. So I think in Trump there is a particular interlude that's just very peculiar. This is a very peculiar experience, and as I say, what happened on Tuesday is not the it's not the end, but it's the end of the beginning. And I think something important changed yesterday or on Tuesday. But I think in the broader culture, it's in writing this talk, I struggled with that question personally, because either when you defend humility, you either sound insincere. Who is a columnist and pundit to claim humility? And that's a problem. Or you sound like you lack conviction, or you sound like some kind of wimp, which is also not a popular thing to be. And so I guess the answer is we need to hold up strong examples of humility, which is why I like to cite Lincoln, I like to cite Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy had his share of it. There have been, I think the argument we need to make is the greatest leaders, not necessarily successful leaders, not all successful leaders, but the greatest leaders had a sense of their own limitations, a sense of their own, if you will, sinfulness, and a sense of the ambiguity of even good projects. And I know that those last words appeal greatly to one of the country's greatest scholars, Reinhold Niebuhr, because that's what he taught us all the time. Jim, thank you.
I'm going to preface this question by saying that it comes from reading a recent issue of Daedalus about the idea of deliberative democracy, because if I were to ask you to get practical as somebody who studies political theory, it would seem pretty rich. So this is
go
something
ahead.
that comes out of immersion in the difficulties that people who study deliberative democracy have found in the attempt to practice it. And so when you talk about the need for conversion and the need for humility, I'm persuaded, although those are in tension with each other, right? Because if we're going to convert, we assume we have something to convert people to, which requires us to have a certain kind of self-confidence. So you're aware of this tension.
But can I just say one thing? I do not believe that humility is an antonym to self-confidence. On the contrary, I think I would want to make an argument that only a genuinely confident person can have the humility to acknowledge imperfection. And so I would take it as a sign of confidence. I'd like humility to be a strong virtue in that sense, not a weak virtue.
Okay. Well
and so, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the question I want to ask is actually quite a simple question. Can you give us an example or two of situations in which people who are as different from each other, who disagree with each other as profoundly as so many of us do with people on the other side of the political spectrum, have been able to come together? Because the problem with the effort for deliberative democracy is that the power imbalances, the situations in which different people find themselves when they come into these deliberative meetings, in some ways poison them from the start. And so what I'd like to have you do is give us some illustrations of how you think the virtues, and I think they are real virtues of democracy that you're describing to us, have been shown to work.
Well, in a way, I think if I take your question correctly, where debate led to conversion, or led either conversion or convergence. One of my favorite examples involves Barney Frank, not necessarily always seen as a humble person, Barney, although I love Barney. He once said that moderate Republicans are always there when you don't need them. And relevant to this, he said, my opponents believe that life begins at conception and ends at birth. And that very line that Barney used to use was actually effective in the context of a debate, that Barney Frank and Henry Hyde would often have set-piece debates about abortion. And Barney would make his point that if you care about life, if you want moms to bring kids into the world, what are you going to do about WIC, with the Women's Infants and Children program? What are you going to do about food stamps? What are you going to do about all the programs we have that actually help mothers who bring children into the world? And after one of these debates, Henry Hyde stood up and said, Barney Frank is right. I am going to change my votes on a series of issues. And he did change his votes on these issues. Now, Barney was at times very harsh in his debating style, but in a way you could argue that he entered imaginatively into the mind and heart of Henry Hyde and his opponents on the other side of this very difficult issue, and persuaded them that if they wanted to be consistent with themselves, they really could not continue to hold a position opposed to abortion and then vote down all these programs. It's someone I trust will say that in the debate over this tax bill about a party that claims to be pro-life and repeals the adoption tax credit as part of a tax reform to cut corporate taxes. So that is one example I can think of. I think you saw a lot of conversion around the climate issue and then a snapback. I think if you look at the early 2000s, you actually had Republicans like John, it's the two that come to mind, and it's not because of what they've done recently, but it's where they were at the time. Republicans like John McCain and Bob Corker both acknowledged that, yes, climate change has a human cause and we have to do something about it. And McCain introduced a bill with Joe Lieberman Corker was talking about carbon taxes. Now, he didn't want a complicated cap and trade thing because he was a kind of free market person, but he said, yes, carbon taxes could be market friendly. Now, since then, you've had a kind of retrenchment in the Republican Party on this issue as the power of the extractive industries in that party is extraordinary. And it's become not a matter of science, but a matter, a strange, in a way, matter for ideology. But I think climate is an area where, is something that a lot of people found difficult to believe at the beginning, became persuasive to large numbers of people, including people on the other side. And lastly, civil rights. I think that if you look, in the Selma movie, in a way, one of my favorite scenes was when they showed the violence in the South against the civil rights demonstrators, and they showed living rooms in which white people were looking at these pictures. And something happened there where the people at the other end of these pictures said, this is wrong. Something is wrong here. In a few cases, they bravely went south and risked their lives. In a lot of cases, it was just a quiet change of mind. It was, this situation cannot continue anymore. And to ignore, we have so much more progress to make. We have so many problems in this sphere. Yet to ignore how radical the change in our country was from 1954 to 1970 or 1968 is to ignore one of the great changes of heart in the country. And even if one argues that the change wasn't fundamental enough, that people still certainly harbored some racist feelings, nonetheless, that was an extraordinary conversion. And I really do believe that it was the power of a movement that found arguments within our Constitution, within our Declaration of Independence, and within shared scripture that helped bring about change. So it was really, I think, militancy combined with a genuine effort to reach hearts. Kathy? Yeah, there's one right behind you.
First, thank you so much for reading my book. I'm going to tell my mother the minute I get home.
It's a great book. It's an important book.
We're talking about entering into the minds and hearts of other people, and I'd like to ask you to conjoin your experience and expertise as a journalist with your reading in political theory and sociology and divinity, and say, how do you do that in 140 characters, or what now,
280. Now it's easy. We got twice as many.
But that's true, but has something fundamentally shifted, with Trump being the Twitter president, with the whole shift not only to the blogosphere but increasingly to the Twitter feed, that makes the kind of conversations we need to have even more difficult? And how would you assess this, thinking about your experience as a journalist who's gone from print media, television, and now the Twitterverse?
Yeah, the first piece of it is, one of the great things about being a journalist is you can talk to anybody, anywhere. You have an excuse to ask anyone anything, which is probably why I met my wife on the subway in Washington, D.C., because I started talking to her and asking her questions on the subway. But this allows you to enter, yeah, it's true. In fact, I always like to say my favorite sentence, actually, I acknowledged Mary in one of the books, and I said I could thank her for a lot of things, but instead I'll thank the designers of the D.C. Metro system, where I met her one Easter Sunday afternoon. And then the last line proves I really am some kind of big government liberal. The last line is, never has anyone owed more to an agency of government. But with, as a journalist, now this is less true than it used to be, but as a journalist, you could walk into a town in West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky or an African-American neighborhood in the inner city or anywhere you wanted to, and you had a certain standing to be the agent through whom people could tell their stories. And so you could learn a lot about people, about a neighborhood, about what concerns people have. And stories of that sort did not work if they were not, in some deep sense, empathetic. I remember there's a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Bay Ridge that I was writing about that is predominantly, was then predominantly Irish and Italian. And I said, oh, this is, you're like Saturday Night Fever. And he said very offendedly, no, those people live in Bensonhurst. And, but I learned that was actually instructive about the attitude toward, and I think that there have been historically so many great journalists who allowed people to see other lives. Michael Harrington's great book, The Other America, which sort of taught a lot of Americans that we have a whole lot of poor people in the country that you are paying no attention to at all. And through a review in the New Yorker, it reached John F. Kennedy and helped lead to the war on poverty. So empathy is possible, and journalism, at least in part, ought to be an exercise. Parts of what we do ought to be an exercise in empathy, particularly as people who are not privileged are concerned. That we really have to try to give voice to this. And many of my colleagues who do that kind of work in neighborhoods and communities around the country, I think, are doing God's work in this sphere. Now, does our new world make this impossible? Well, we have a lot of things pulling us apart. Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. We don't even live near people who disagree with us. Now, we've always had various forms of segregation in America, racial segregation, certainly. But the evidence is that we now have those old forms of segregation compounded by new forms of what you might call intellectual or moral segregation. Bill Bishop, the guy who wrote The Big Sort, discovered that the number of counties in America that were going by landslides to one side or the other, even in close elections, just had increased exponentially. In our neighborhood in Bethesda, Maryland, I told our kids once, I really admire people who put up Republican signs, because it took a lot of guts in our 80+% for Obama neighborhood to put up signs for McCain or Romney. Similarly, just 30 miles away in parts of Prince William County, Virginia, 80% of the signs would be for McCain or Romney, and it would take guts to put up an Obama sign. So we are, even before you get to new media, we are more separating each other. And within our religious congregations, and we've talked about this, the political divisions are even greater than they used to be. Again, there's always been some of this. I don't romanticize the past, but I think there's evidence that this is worse. Now the technology kind of reinforces that. And I also think there's a distance and coldness to the technology. People, I think, say meaner things because they are almost by definition ill-considered. People often respond in a very quick fashion without thinking real hard about what they are setting out, and people tend to follow the way Facebook works, sending you stuff you agree with, your friends send you stuff you agree with. If Bill Bishop is right, you have fewer friends who disagree with you. And now things are so bad that even family members who disagree don't even want to talk about politics anymore. We grew up in a very raucous family where every family gathering was a raucous political argument, extended family gathering. And now people are even afraid to do that. So it is, all of that is very troubling. But I still am not convinced it's technological. I'm still, and obviously news media, Fox News is a rather special thing, as I noted earlier. But I still think the division pre-existed. I think the causal arrow goes more from the ideological and philosophical division to the media than the other way around. The media just aggravates it. The new technology makes everything more efficient, including our hatred for each other. But I think there are other reasons for that hatred. And so therefore, we're going to try to heal it in other ways. Please, ma'am. You smiled reassuringly at certain points, and I want to thank you for that.
I'm Connie Williams. I'm married to Preston here. So, my question is about the use of language in trying to bring sides together. And I'll just give a couple of examples. I was so happy when you made the observation that there are some black working class people in this country.
Like quite a lot.
Yes, and I keep thinking, well, I haven't seen Steve Kornacki break it down for me as to how many working class black people voted, for anybody, or and just the use of the term white working class exclusively, I think has been extremely divisive and, of course, totally inaccurate. And I wonder how in our conversations and trying to bring people together, we can correct some of that. And then one other language use that has bothered me since I was a child, growing up in West Virginia, and listening to people campaign all over the country, is that we are a nation of immigrants. That's partly true. We are a nation of immigrants, but nobody ever says in a political campaign, we are a nation of descendants of slaves, Native Americans, and immigrants. And that's a more accurate statement. But we never hear that in our conversation. And I'd just like some comment about that.
No, I thank you on both of those. On the whole working class issue, my dissertation, by the way, was on white working class racial attitudes in Britain and the United States, and so it's something, and how it's sort of from the 50s to Thatcher and the 50s to Reagan, and so I've struggled with this question for a long time because it is. And it's something that when we wrote our book, we talked a lot about, because there is something fundamentally wrong with losing everybody else in the working class except for white people. And, that by some measures, you might get close to a majority of the working class who aren't white. Second, we have a problem with that term now in any event, because usually when people use that, they're using a poll-determined category that is non-college whites, whites who didn't go to college. Why is that? Well, because we don't have as many classic working class jobs anymore. We don't have as many auto or steel or coal mining jobs or textile jobs as we used to have. So it is, in a way, already, to begin with, this kind of artificial construct. I think that it is correct to focus some attention on less advantaged whites, and that maybe in some ways that's a more appropriate term, because I think there are some deeper than ever divisions along class lines within the white community. And I think we've got to face those and be explicit about what we need to do about it as a society. But I always now have gotten in the habit of pointing out that the working class is multiracial, because it's so misleading in the way you talk about it. And, if you really want to sort of think about how a racist would look at it, that a racist would deny that black people could be working class, and you don't want to do anything to contribute to that kind of view. Second thing is, I think that we do need to remember that fighting economic injustice and racial injustice went hand in hand in the civil rights struggle. I've been talking a lot about, and I actually tried to find it for David kindly lent me his office, and there's some space there, and I wanted to put up a poster or something. And what I tried to find, which I wasn't able to find, was a poster from the '63 Civil Rights March, because it's been on my mind a lot because of this question. Because as you remember, or might remember, you're too young to remember. The slogan of that march was jobs and freedom. One of the biggest funders of that march was the United Auto Workers Union. And that jobs and freedom says that we've got to talk about economic justice and we've got to talk about racial justice. And Martin Luther King himself died after speaking at a labor strike. So we need to find ways of talking about this in a different way that bring people back together across these lines. And we've done it at some moments. Bobby Kennedy did it at certain moments, toward the end, and we never got to see how that was going to turn out. But we, as I said, it's a terrible politics that, I think that the president uses of really holding one group's pain against another group's pain, and that's what we got to fight against. There was Yeah, no, you're right about that. I'm going to just take that away, maybe I can pledge never to use that phrase, nation of immigrants, again without qualification, because it's true. And I don't think most people who use it intend it that way, but they are forgetting something very important. So, thank you.
I want to make a comment about the white working class. One of the things that is being pointed out by a number of people is that white working class rose to their position of comfortableness in the society by an affirmative action program for them. When you had the FDR legislation, when you had the GI Bill, etc., you had in the law, especially in housing, an exclusion of African Americans from the programs. You had redlining, etc. And what, in a sense, is happening to them is that they are becoming more an average person and not a person favored by the government in the way that the government did during the FDR period, etc.
Well, let me tell you how much I agree with that. There are little things in your life that you are proud of, just small things. And as you know, and you might be referencing him, Ira Katznelson, the great scholar, wrote a book about the exclusion of African Americans from a lot of the New Deal programs. And he and I ran into each other at a political science meeting, and he was describing the book, and he didn't like the title he had, and he was telling me what it was about, and I just looked at him and I said, "When Affirmative Action Was White," and that was my title, and which he very kindly acknowledged in the book. So I think that's true, and I think that's one of the reasons Ira's scholarship is so important, because he is a great friend of the New Deal in certain respects. So am I, but he was very conscious of the ways in which, in order to get the New Deal through a Congress where there were a lot of Southern segregationist committee chairs who were Democrats, the New Deal, Social Security itself excluded domestic workers. It excluded a lot of groups who happened to be disproportionately African American. What's interesting is that African Americans in the North became, on the whole, supporters of FDR because, the witness of others in the New Deal, particularly Eleanor Roosevelt, was on behalf of civil rights, even though FDR himself was timid. But also there were other aspects of that program that ended up lifting up African Americans, and probably the most important was the Wagner Act that allowed the formation of unions. And once African Americans moved north and began working, particularly in steel and auto, they became members of the UAW, or the United Steelworkers. That raised their wages. So there were sort of New Deal things that made African Americans convert from Republican to Democrat. But you're absolutely right about the exclusion, and that you're absolutely right that the New Deal helped lift up previously underprivileged whites to a better position, even as African Americans weren't lifted up. But
Comments. One in terms of the march for freedom, for work, and for freedom. That goes back, of course, to the New Deal when Randolph threatened the march, and he didn't carry it out because of the action of Roosevelt in creating a
Fair Employment Practices Commission, yeah.
Commission. But that commission never accomplished anything which was really beneficial for African Americans. The implementation, as in most civil rights acts, it was not very good.
No, I mean, I think the war happened, and it was an excuse to sort of not to push on that front. Truman came along and at least did act in the case of the military. I mean, I think one of the sort of hidden strengths of the civil rights movement, two of it had to do with foreign policy in the first instance, because so many African Americans fought for the United States in World War II, and it became untenable to have all these GIs come home to segregation, and it created, I think, they created a kind of pressure that didn't exist before, and the other was the Cold War, where we were appealing to nations, third world nations that were mostly people of color, at a time when our country was segregated. And so it became in the foreign policy interest of the United States to move on civil rights. So I think, as I say, I think the movement itself was deeply important. I think the movement's language, approach, and argument was deeply important. But I think there are other factors that had to do with self-interest, again, a Niebuhrian point, that you can do the right thing for the right reasons, and you can do the right things for sort of self-interested reasons, but at least they get you there. So thank you for that, sir. I appreciate it. Please.
Maybe last one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My brilliant student. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I have a very brief question. I wondered if you could speak to your use of the word militant throughout your talk this evening. I was surprised to hear you say it, and not because of, I think, what the spirit that it was representing, but the particular choice of that word.
Oh, that's interesting. I appreciate the question. But could I ask you quickly, just pass it back the mic, what is it about militant that surprised you, if you don't mind my asking back?
I guess in class throughout the semester, we've talked a lot about Dr. King, and I don't think you've ever used the word militant. You've instead said radical.
Oh.
And both of them, could potentially be good or bad light. Generally, it's up for discussion, obviously. But
I think some of it, first of all, I think militant is not a bad word, and I use it in a positive sense. And I think I may have been looking for a strong word because I was calling for understanding and did not want in any way to say that understanding was intended to get in the way of forceful action. Number two, I think I was using the language of King himself. I mean, militancy, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Williams, but militancy was a term of art, in a sense, in the civil rights movement that King himself used. I think in the I Have a Dream speech, he talks about the glorious spirit of a new militancy. I think that's a phrase in there. So I think I was affected in my thinking by King's own language and by the language of the movement of the time. But I also wanted to convey, I really do think this is a dangerous time for us. It's a dangerous time for our country. It is a time when I think democracy is under threat. It is a time where we're seeing a real rollback in achievements that we thought were secure, whether it's the Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the court, and now we have voter suppression laws around the country. We thought that we knew there was opposition to immigration, but we never expected to have a president speak about immigrants from other countries in the way this president had. We never expected to see the threats to women that we see today. We never expected to see this kind of challenge to basic decency. And so if there's ever a time where militancy strikes me as an appropriate word, this is it. And I call for understanding, not because I want to reduce our militancy in any way in opposing what I see as some deep wrongs, but rather to say that to win this fight, we need to, I'll use my convert word, we need to convert some hearts or minds or political attitudes of people who currently disagree with us. And I think we can do that by acknowledging that there are some people out there who really are so deeply racist and prejudiced that they are not likely to listen to us anyway. But there are a lot of other people whom I think are prepared to listen to people who at least convey some sense that they are suffering too, that they have legitimate concerns. And so that's why I think we have to combine militancy with an effort to reach out in a spirit of brotherhood.
Thank you.
And sisterhood, I should add. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.